My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been the keeper at Mercy Point Lighthouse for 4 years. That's longer than most people expect when they take the job. The position isn't advertised widely anymore, and the foundation doesn't recruit aggressively. When you show up at the concrete office building in Portland and ask about work at the Lighthouse, you get a specific type of person responding to you. They don't smile much. They don't oversell the role. They tell you the work is solitary, the pay is modest, and you'll be living in a small cottage on a rocky peninsula about 20 miles from the nearest town. They show you photographs of the structure, a white tower, maybe 100 feet tall, automated for decades, requiring mainly maintenance rather than constant presence. It sounds like the kind of job that someone desperate for distance would take, which I was. I took the job because I needed to disappear for a while. My personal life had become the kind of complicated that doesn't resolve easily, and I thought isolation might reset something fundamental in how I related to other people. A failed marriage, a professional reputation that had been damaged by circumstances beyond my control, a sense of having become invisible to everyone I knew, despite being surrounded by people. The Lighthouse seemed like the right place for that kind of radical disconnection. I wasn't wrong about the isolation part. What I didn't anticipate was how the isolation would begin to feel less like a reprieve and more like a container for something else entirely. The cottage sits about a quarter mile from the lighthouse structure itself. The path between them is paved but narrow, deteriorating in places where salt air and weather have worn through the asphalt. It takes about 8 minutes to walk on a clear day. In bad weather, the walk takes longer because you have to watch your footing carefully. The ocean surrounds the lighthouse on 3 sides, and the wind comes off the water with enough force to make you lean into it, your body angled against something that feels almost physical in its resistance. The lighthouse beam rotates automatically now. It has for decades. My job is mainly maintenance, checking the mechanical systems, replacing light bulbs in the beacon assembly, dealing with the corrosion that salt air creates on every exposed metal surface, and generally ensuring that the structure remains functional and safe. It's work that requires attention to detail, but not much intellectual engagement, which suited me fine at the time. I keep logs, multiple kinds. There's the formal maintenance log that I submit monthly to the foundation. It documents routine work, equipment replacement, any repairs that have been performed. And there's a personal journal where I write observations about the weather, about my own mental state, about the way the isolation is either helping or not helping with whatever I was trying to work through when I arrived. And there's a third log that I started keeping about 6 months into my tenure, which is where I record anything unusual. That log is mostly empty, which is how I preferred it. Unusual is destabilizing when you're trying to maintain equilibrium. The unusual started small, barely significant enough to warrant notation. A fishing boat that would appear on the horizon at nearly the same time each week, moving through the same pattern, never getting closer to shore. A particular seabird that seemed to follow the same flight path every morning, regardless of wind or tide. These things aren't actually unusual for a coastal environment. Animals and weather systems follow patterns. Human behavior follows patterns. The natural world is built on repetition. I understood that intellectually, But there was something in the repetition that began to feel less like natural cycles and more like choreography. Like something was maintaining the pattern deliberately, keeping it consistent in a way that the natural world rarely does. By month 7, Eindijks, I was filling pages in the unusual log with observations about things that weren't quite right. The tide seemed to come in at times that didn't align with the tide tables. The weather forecast would predict clear skies, and it would rain anyway, following a pattern that I couldn't quite quantify, but that felt structured somehow. The seabird disappeared and reappeared according to some schedule that I couldn't determine, but that I could predict if I paid attention. I was beginning to spend more time observing these patterns than actually performing my job, which was a warning sign that I recognized and chose to ignore. The first real incident occurred about 8 months into my position. I was in the lamp room of the lighthouse. That's the chamber at the top where the beacon mechanism sits, performing routine maintenance on the Fresnel lens. And it was a clear morning in late May, the kind of day where you can see the curvature of the ocean's surface and the sky extends endlessly in every direction. The visibility was extraordinary. I could see individual rocks on islands that were supposedly miles away. I was cleaning dust from the lens assembly, a task that required concentration and careful movement because the glass was valuable and fragile, when I heard something that didn't belong in that space. A knocking sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from below me in the stairwell. The lighthouse stairs are iron. They spiral upward through an open core, and when you're in the lamp room, you can hear sounds from the lower levels clearly. Footsteps, voices, the mechanical hum of the automated systems. This knocking wasn't any of those things. It was someone deliberately striking something metal, creating a pattern. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more taps, then a longer pause before the pattern repeated. It wasn't random. It was communicating something, though I couldn't determine what. I descended the stairs carefully, listening to the sound grow louder as I approached its source. The knocking continued, always maintaining that distance between me and its source, always staying just far enough ahead that I never quite reached it. When I reached the bottom of the lighthouse, the knocking stopped abruptly. Complete silence. There was no one in the structure. I checked the maintenance building, the surrounding grounds, the path back to the cottage. No one was there. No one in the vicinity at all. Only just the wind moving through the structure and the distant sound of waves against the rocks. I told myself I'd misidentified the sound. Wind through the structure, creating resonances that sounded like intentional knocking. Metal settling and contracting in the temperature, shifts between night and day. The ocean creating illusions. Through sound reflection, waves hitting the rocks at just the right angle to create a rhythmic pattern. The rational explanations were all available and plausible. I documented it in my unusual log. Potential acoustic anomaly, 8:47 a.m., lamp room. Repetitive knocking sound originating from lower stairwell, no source identified, and moved on with my day. But I didn't forget it. The pattern of the knocking played through my head repeatedly. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, longer pause. It was almost musical, but not quite. There was an intentionality to it that my brain couldn't quite dismiss as natural. I found myself reconstructing the sound at random moments throughout the day, while eating lunch, while reading, while lying in bed at night. My unconscious mind was clearly fascinated by it, even as my conscious mind tried to rationalize it away. Then the storm started, and they brought other things with them. The first storm came in early October, just as the season was transitioning from the relatively clear weather of late summer to the more volatile systems that arrive as the year moves toward winter. It was the kind of system that meteorologists issue warnings about. The pressure dropped steadily, and the meteorological stations reported wind speeds that would reach gusts of 60 miles per hour or higher by evening. I prepared the cottage methodically, following a checklist that the foundation had provided. I filled fuel tanks for the backup generator. I secured anything that might blow away. I checked the storm shutters. I verified that the emergency supplies were where they were supposed to be. The Lighthouse is built to withstand weather far worse than anything the Pacific Coast typically produces. It was constructed in 1887 and had survived over a century of major storms. I wasn't concerned about structural damage. What I wasn't prepared for was the visitor. It was evening when the power went out. Not just the cottage power, but the backup systems at the Lighthouse too. That was unusual enough to warrant investigation. The backup system should have engaged automatically when the primary power failed, and the fact that they hadn't suggested either a mechanical failure or something more unusual. I put on rain gear and made my way down to the Lighthouse structure, heading directly for the control room where the backup power systems are housed. The wind was violent enough that I had to stop several times to maintain balance, leaning my shoulder against the wind and advancing in stages rather than moving with continuous forward momentum. When I reached the Lighthouse, I noticed something that made me pause. Before entering, there was a light on in the lamp room. Not the beacon, that would have required power, and the beacon was dark. A handheld light. A flashlight or lantern. Someone was up there in the dark, during the storm, in a structure that should have been locked and empty. The light moved slowly, as if whoever was holding it was examining something. I keep all the keys. There are 2 sets, one set in the cottage, one set in the control room. Both sets were in my possession. I had locked the Lighthouse before the storm arrived, a habit from the early days of my tenure. There was no way for someone to enter the structure unless I had given them a key or provided access, which I hadn't. I climbed the stairs, moving slowly and carefully because the lack of power meant no artificial lighting in the stairwell. I had my own flashlight, but I kept it off, preferring to move through the darkness and let my eyes adjust to whatever ambient light filtered through the small windows. The wind was loud enough inside the stairwell that I couldn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no movement, uttered no indication of whether the person with the lantern was staying still or moving through the structure. The light in the lamp room grew brighter as I climbed. My heart rate increased with each step, though I couldn't have articulated why. There was nothing threatening about a person with a flashlight, but there was something threatening about a person being inside a locked structure that I alone had access to. There was something threatening about the fact that I couldn't explain their presence or their entry. When I reached the top of the Lighthouse, I found a man standing at the lens assembly, looking out toward the ocean. He was holding a battery-powered camping lantern that cast shadows across the curved walls. He was wearing wet clothes that clung to his frame, and his hair was plastered to his head. He looked at me with an expression of profound sadness mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. Resignation, perhaps, or recognition. "You're the new keeper," he said. It wasn't a question. He said it with complete certainty, as if he had been expecting me to arrive at precisely this moment. I didn't answer immediately. I was trying to process how this person had gotten into a locked structure during a storm in conditions where visibility outside would be near zero. I was trying to figure out whether I should be afraid or whether I was overreacting to an unusual but ultimately explicable situation. I used to keep this light, he continued, still looking toward the ocean. I kept it for almost 15 years. That was a long time to live with the routine, the maintenance, the solitude, or just the sense that I was doing something important, something that mattered. But I understood the purpose of it. I understood why it had to be maintained, why someone had to be here watching it, ensuring that it kept burning. That was the contract, I think. That was the implicit understanding. How did you get in here? I asked. My voice sounded strange in the enclosed space, swallowed by the wind that moved continuously around the lamp room. He didn't answer that question. He turned to look at me fully, and even in the lamplight, I could see that something was off about his expression. He looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. He looked as if he had been tired for a very long time, and the tiredness had become so integral to his being that he couldn't remember what it felt like to be rested. "And you'll figure it out," he said. "The pattern, eventually you'll see it. The storms bring people here, and they come asking for the old keeper. That's what they say, the ones who come. They say they need to speak with the old keeper. They're very specific about that. They don't ask for a keeper. They ask for the old keeper. Do you understand what that means?" "I don't understand what you're talking about," I said. "No," he agreed, "but you will. Give it time. The storms will keep coming, and people will keep appearing, and eventually you'll start to see the structure of it, the pattern. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. That's the thing about understanding. It's irreversible." He turned back toward the window, looking out into the darkness. "When you see him," he said, and I realized he meant someone specific, or as though I didn't know who. "Tell him that Robert came back during the storm. Tell him I tried to leave, but I couldn't quite manage it. Tell him the lighthouse is still standing and the light is still burning. He'll understand what that means." "I don't know who you're talking about," I said. "No," Robert said, "but you will." And then the lantern flickered and went out. Complete darkness. I heard him moving, but the sound was muffled by the wind. I fumbled for my own flashlight and pointed it at the space where he had been standing, but he was already gone. The beam illuminated nothing but empty air and the curve of the lamp room wall. I descended the stairs as quickly as I safely could, my flashlight beam bouncing ahead of me. But when I reached the bottom, there was no sign of him. The maintenance room was empty. Each of the equipment was undisturbed. The doors were still locked from the inside with no indication of how they had been opened. The storm continued through the night. I sat in the control room, reviewing the backup power systems for any indication of what had caused the failure. Everything looked operational. There was no obvious malfunction. By the time morning arrived, power had been restored, apparently through some automatic mechanism that I couldn't identify. The backup systems had engaged during the period of power loss, though the records didn't show exactly when they had come back online. I went through the structure methodically in the daylight, looking for any sign of how someone could have entered. There was no forced entry, no open windows, no damage to the doors or locks, no muddy footprints or signs of disturbance. It was as if Robert had simply materialized in the lamp room and dematerialized again. I considered several explanations. hallucination seemed most plausible. Stress, isolation, and a sudden encounter with an unusual weather event could trigger perceptual disturbances. I was aware enough of my own psychology to recognize that isolation could create its own problems. The human mind, removed from normal social stimulation, could begin to construct its own stimulation. It could hallucinate. It could create elaborate narratives to fill the void of external input. So I made a decision to document it and move forward. I added an entry to my unusual log. October 14th, 10:30 p.m. Storm. Possible trespasser or hallucination. Man in lamp room asking for old keeper. Unknown method of entry or exit. Departed during storm conditions. No physical evidence of presence. I didn't report it to the Foundation. There didn't seem to be a point. What would I say? I wasn't injured. Nothing was stolen or damaged, and if it turned out I'd hallucinated the entire thing, reporting it would only raise questions about my psychological fitness for the position. The Foundation had hired me to maintain the lighthouse, and I was maintaining it. The fact that I might be experiencing occasional perceptual disturbances seemed irrelevant to that core responsibility. For 3 weeks, nothing remarkable happened. The weather was clear. The maintenance routine continued. I kept my logs, the official one for the Foundation, the personal journal, and the unusual log where I recorded anything that deviated from normal experience. The days felt normal in the way that days feel when nothing is disrupting your established patterns. Normal is a surprisingly stable state, I discovered. Once you're in it, it's easy to assume it will continue indefinitely. It's easy to forget that stability is always provisional, always dependent on conditions that can change without warning. Then the next storm arrived, and it came from a different direction, moving faster than the forecast had predicted. By the time I realized it was arriving, it was already on top of the lighthouse. The pressure drop was steep, and the wind velocity increased rapidly, moving from 15 to 30 to 50 miles per hour in the course of a few hours. I secured the cottage and made my way down to prepare the lighthouse for the storm. Me moving through my routine with the methodical precision that had become habitual. I went through the checklist, securing loose items, checking the backup generator, verifying that the automated systems would function without human intervention. Everything was in order. It was late afternoon when I finished the preparations. The light was already beginning to fade and the storm was moving closer, its leading edge visible as a darkening of the sky and an increase in wind intensity. I was about to head back to the cottage when I saw movement on the access road, the paved path that connected the lighthouse complex to the main coastal highway. A figure walking toward the lighthouse in the rain. I couldn't see clearly enough to identify anything about them except that they were human-shaped and moving deliberately toward the structure. It's moving with purpose that suggested they had a reason for being here. I stepped outside to intercept them, pulling my rain hood tight against the wind. The lighthouse is closed to visitors during storms, I called out as they approached. You need to get to shelter. There's a town about 3 miles back the way you came. The figure came into clearer view. It was a woman, maybe in her 60s, wearing a coat that was inadequate for the weather conditions. She was soaked. Her hair was plastered to her head and her clothes were dripping. She looked at me with an intensity that made me want to step backward, an intensity that suggested absolute certainty about something. I need to speak with the old keeper, she said. Her voice carried over the wind with surprising clarity. There is no old keeper here, I said. I'm the current keeper. Sheikh, my name is Marcus. No, she said. She said it with absolute certainty, shaking her head. You're not the old keeper. I need to speak with him. This is important. He'll want to see me. He always wants to see me when I come here, even though he shouldn't, even though he knows he shouldn't. I'm the only person here, I said. There hasn't been anyone else at this lighthouse for the 4 years I've been working here. If you're looking for someone specific, maybe you have the wrong location. There are other lighthouses on the coast. There's one about 40 miles north. There's another one further south. She shook her head repeatedly, water spraying from her hair. It has to be here, she said. I can feel him. He's always in here when the storms come. I don't understand how it works, but I know it's true. He's in the lighthouse right now. I didn't know how to respond to that. The woman was clearly distressed, and standing in the rain in deteriorating conditions wasn't helping either of us. Her lips were starting to turn blue, and she was shaking. Whether from cold or from emotional distress, I couldn't tell. Come inside, I said, gesturing toward the maintenance building. We can get you dry and you can tell me what this is about. You can't stay out in this weather. She didn't move. When you see him, she said, and I could hear desperation in her voice. Will you tell him that Margaret came back? Tell him I tried to follow the pattern. I tried to understand it, but I couldn't stay. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I came back to explain, but I still can't explain. Tell him I understand now. And I couldn't have understood before. And that's the thing that makes it worse. I don't know what pattern you're talking about, I said. The one he's trapped in, Margaret said. The one all the keepers are trapped in. The cycle, the rotation, the way it keeps going and we keep trying to warn each other, but we never quite manage to explain it because the understanding doesn't come with words. The understanding just comes. I don't know what you mean, I said, but as I spoke, I felt something cold move through my chest. Not from the weather, but from something else. A kind of recognition that I didn't understand, but that seemed important. The lighthouse, Margaret said. The cycle. Why we keep coming back. Why we can't leave. Why the storms bring us here and we find ourselves asking for the old keeper, even though we know there is no old keeper. Just the new keeper, who will become the old keeper, who will understand eventually what we couldn't explain while we were here. Then she turned and walked back toward the access road, moving with surprising speed despite her apparent distress and the difficult weather conditions. I followed her. But she moved with purpose, and by the time I reached the road, she was gone. There was no vehicle, no footprints in the mud, though the rain was falling hard enough that any tracks would have been erased quickly anyway. She had simply disappeared into the rain and the darkness and the sound of the wind. I spent the next several hours in a state of unsettled confusion. I documented the encounter in my unusual log with precision. 5:47 p.m. Woman identified as Margaret appeared on Access Road during approaching storm and claimed to know an old keeper, referenced a pattern and a cycle and rotation, stated that all the keepers are trapped in something, departed on foot in direction of Access Road. No vehicle identified, disappeared from sight. That night, I called the Foundation's after-hours emergency line and described what had happened. I was careful to present it factually, emphasizing that the woman appeared to be in physical danger from the weather, and that she had left the premises before I could ensure her safety. I didn't mention the strange things she had said. I didn't mention the pattern or the cycle or the comment about keepers being trapped. The woman who answered the emergency line, Patricia, the Foundation's emergency coordinator, listened to my description without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I could hear wind in her end of the line, despite the late hour. Or maybe it was just the sound of rainfall. "Can you describe her?" Patricia asked. I described Margaret in detail, her apparent age, her appearance, her clothing, what I could remember of her exact words. "Did she give you a last name?" Patricia asked. "No," I said. "She only said her first name. Margaret." Another pause. "I need you to do something for me," Patricia said. "I'm going to send you some information via secure email. I want you to read it carefully. And then I need you to decide whether you want to continue in your position at the Lighthouse. Because what you've experienced tonight is not random. It's not a mental health crisis. It's part of a pattern that we have documented. And I need to know if you're willing to accept the position, knowing what that pattern entails." "What pattern?" I asked. "I'll explain when you've read the material," Patricia said. "But Marcus, I need you to understand something right now. The woman you saw, the woman who called herself Margaret, she's real. She was real. But she's also someone who left the Lighthouse position years ago. And the fact that she appeared to you, asking about the old keeper, means that something about your presence here has triggered a cycle that usually remains dormant until later in a keeper's tenure. Usually it takes longer for this to start. Usually it takes a year or more before the first visitation occurs. The fact that it's happening to you only 4 months in suggests that either you're unusually susceptible to whatever is happening, or the cycle is accelerating. Either way, I need you to be aware of what you might be dealing with. After we ended the call, I waited for the email from Patricia. It arrived about 20 minutes later. The subject line read, "Keeper Rotation Documentation, Restricted Access." Inside the email was a link to a secure folder. The password Patricia provided gave me access to documents that would fundamentally change how I understood my position at the Lighthouse. The files contained photographs of past keepers, 7 of them across as many decades. The dates indicated that some of them had served for only a few months, while others had tenure measured in years. There were also documents that appeared to be personal journals or logs, excerpts from which had been transcribed and organized by date. And there was a comprehensive list of names with dates and annotations that seemed to chronicle the keeper rotation across decades. Most disturbing was the notation next to each keeper's final entry. Most of them read, "Storm visitation noted. Documentation ceased. Subject became unavailable for contact." The most recent annotation was my own. Marcus Webb. Position begins August 2020. Currently stable. No incidents reported. Except that annotation was now outdated. There had been incidents. There had been 2 visitations already. I searched through the documentation looking for any mention of Margaret. I found her in the records from 1984. Margaret Chen had been keeper from 1982 to 1984. The notation next to her name read, "Long tenure, multiple storm visitations documented. Final entry dated October 1984. Subject became unavailable for contact, November 1984. 37 years ago, 3.5 decades. I called Patricia back immediately. It was past midnight, but the emergency line answered immediately, suggesting that someone was monitoring it specifically for incoming calls. "The woman I saw," I said. "Margaret, she was a keeper in the 1980s. That's impossible." "Is it?" Patricia asked. "I need you to understand what the Lighthouse does, Marcus. I need you to understand the cycle before you experience more of it, before it becomes even more impossible to make sense of. And that's when Patricia told me everything. Over the following weeks, Patricia sent me additional documentation, and we had several conversations that became progressively more detailed and more disturbing. And that what I learned was this: the Lighthouse has been documenting a specific phenomenon for decades, a pattern that emerged sometime in the 1950s and has been occurring with increasing regularity ever since. The phenomenon is this: when a keeper is in residence at the Lighthouse, severe storms seem to trigger visitations, appearances by previous keepers who have supposedly left the position years or even decades earlier. The visitations are not consistent in their manifestation. Some of them are clearly visible encounters, like the one I had with Margaret. Others are more subtle, people appearing for only moments or being visible only from certain angles, or leaving traces like sounds, or written messages that suggest their presence, but that don't fully constitute direct contact. Some keepers report encountering the same previous keeper multiple times. Some report encountering different keepers with each storm. The encounters don't follow any easily identifiable pattern, though the Foundation has tried extensively to establish one. What's consistent is this: every keeper who has remained at the Lighthouse long enough has eventually encountered one of these visitations. And every keeper who has experienced multiple visitations has eventually become unavailable for contact, disappeared, or left the position without notice or explanation, with no clear record of their departure. The visitations seem to increase in frequency and intensity the longer a keeper remains in the position. The keepers themselves often become obsessed with understanding the phenomenon. They stop maintaining the Lighthouse properly, and they stop responding to communications from the Foundation. At some point, they either leave the position or they cease to exist in any way that the Foundation can track. Patricia explained that the Foundation's working hypothesis was that there was some kind of temporal anomaly associated with the Lighthouse itself, perhaps something in the structure, perhaps something in the geography of the location, perhaps something in the electromagnetic properties of the beacon itself. The details were unclear, but the pattern was undeniable. When she asked if I wanted to continue in the position knowing what I was potentially facing, my response surprised both of us. I said yes. I wanted to stay. I wanted to understand what was happening, even if that understanding led somewhere dangerous. Patricia didn't try to dissuade me. She simply said that she would provide whatever support she could, though she acknowledged that the support was limited. She asked me to continue submitting the maintenance logs and to report any significant changes in my condition or the frequency of visitations. She asked me to try to document the visitations with as much precision as possible, recording not just what they said, but how they appeared, what they looked like, what condition they seemed to be in. The ones who return, Patricia said during one of our conversations, the ones who keep appearing across years or even decades, they're always confused about time. They never remember leaving. They never understand how much time has passed. They remember being here, and then they remember being here again. And there's a gap they can't account for. It's like they're trapped in a loop that's not quite a loop, because each iteration is slightly different. Over the next 2 years, the visitations became more frequent. During every significant storm, someone appeared asking for the old keeper. They were all people who had previously held the position. They were all confused about how much time had passed. They all expressed a sense of being trapped in something they didn't understand. I documented everything with meticulous precision. I filled multiple journals. I created spreadsheets correlating storm dates with visitation frequency. I analyzed the language each visitor used, looking for consistent themes or patterns in how they described their experience. I became consumed by the attempt to understand the mechanism of what was happening. And slowly, I began to understand something that was far more disturbing than the phenomena themselves. The visitations weren't random events triggered by storms. They were communication attempts. Each keeper who appeared was trying to convey something specific to the current keeper. They were trying to warn me. They were trying to prepare me for something that was coming, though none of them could quite articulate what that something was. One visitor, a woman named Susan, who had been keeper in the 1970s, said something that crystallized the growing dread I was experiencing. She appeared during a particularly violent storm about 3 years into my tenure. She looked directly at me and said, "It's not the lighthouse that's keeping us. It's keeping us as much as we're keeping it. You need to understand that distinction before it's too late. We maintain the light, but the light maintains us too. It holds us in place. It uses us. And once you understand that, once you really understand it, you can't leave anymore, even if you wanted to. The understanding itself becomes the trap." After she disappeared into the rain, I sat in the control room for hours, trying to process what she had said, trying to understand what it meant to be held in place by something, to be maintained by the very thing you were maintaining. Susan had said that the understanding itself becomes the trap. That meant that by trying to understand what was happening, I was actually accelerating my own integration into whatever mechanism was operating in this place. But I couldn't stop trying to understand. Even knowing that the understanding was dangerous, I couldn't abandon the attempt. Answer, the pattern had become the most interesting thing in my life. The mystery was more compelling than any external stimulus I'd experienced in years. My isolation had become complete, but it wasn't the kind of isolation I had sought. It was something else. It was the isolation of knowing something that no one else could understand, of being trapped in a pattern that was becoming more real to me than the external world. I've been at the Lighthouse for 4 years now, and I'm beginning to understand what Patricia meant about becoming unavailable for contact. I can feel it happening. I can feel the boundaries of my consciousness becoming less distinct. I can feel my position in time becoming unstable. Sometimes I lose hours. I'll be in the maintenance room checking equipment, and suddenly I'll be in the lamp room, and I won't remember traveling between them. Or I'll be walking the path between the cottage and the lighthouse, and I'll find myself somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that looks like it might be the cottage from a different era, or the lighthouse from a different season, or a place that's neither, but that feels familiar in a way I can't explain. The storms still come, and the visitors still arrive. But now I'm beginning to wonder if I'm still the current keeper, or if I've already moved into some other phase of the cycle. I'm beginning to wonder if I'm the one who is being asked for, if there's a new keeper somewhere who is seeing me during the storms, hearing my warnings, feeling the pull of the pattern that I'm now part of. The most recent visitation happened just last night. The storm was severe, the wind moving at what the meteorologists would have called dangerous speeds. Rain so heavy that visibility dropped to almost nothing. I went to the lamp room, as I always do during bad weather, to verify that the automated systems were functioning correctly. I wasn't expecting to see anyone. But when I reached the top of the lighthouse, there was a man standing at the lens assembly, looking out toward the ocean. He was young, maybe early 30s. He looked familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. He looked like someone I might have known in my previous life before I came to the lighthouse, but I couldn't pin down who. "The old keeper?" he said, turning to look at me. His voice was sad. He looked at me like he was looking at someone he recognized but couldn't quite place. "I'm the current keeper," I said, but even as the words came out, because I realized how strange they sounded, how uncertain they were. Did I actually know if I was still the current keeper? Did I have any evidence that someone new hadn't replaced me? Had I actually left the lamp room after my last visit? Or had I been standing here the entire time? "No," the man said, "you're not. You're one of the old keepers now. The light has moved on. There's someone else keeping it now. You're here to help me understand what's happening, except you can't quite remember what's happening yourself. Which makes it worse, doesn't it? Which makes it impossible." I didn't answer because I realized I couldn't. I couldn't remember when I had last left the lighthouse. I couldn't remember when I had last spoken to Patricia. I couldn't remember if the cottage still existed or if I had already ceased to need it. I couldn't remember what I had been before I came here. And I couldn't quite grasp who I was becoming. "When you see him," the man said, and I realized he meant someone specific. Someone who would be the next old keeper to appear during the next storm. "Tell him that the cycle continues. Tell him that I stayed longer than I meant to. Tell him that the understanding keeps going deeper." And I thought eventually I would reach the bottom of it. But there is no bottom. The lighthouse is infinite. Tell him the light keeps burning, and the storms keep coming, and the rotation never stops. Then he turned and looked back toward the ocean, and I felt myself beginning to fade. Or he was fading. Or time was collapsing in some way that I didn't have language for. The lamp room was becoming less distinct. The walls seemed to be moving, and the glass of the lens assembly seemed to be reflecting things that weren't there. Other lamp rooms, other storms, other conversations between keepers across decades or centuries. When I looked back toward where the man had been standing, he was gone. But I could still hear his voice. I could still hear him talking, even though he was no longer visible. "The worst part isn't the fear of becoming trapped," he was saying. "The worst part is realizing that the trap isn't something external that was created for us. It's something we create ourselves through the act of trying to maintain the light, through the act of trying to understand the pattern, through the act of trying to warn the next person about what's happening. We're not being kept here. We're keeping ourselves here. The lighthouse is the trap, but we're also the trap. We're making it. We're perpetuating it. We're the cycle." And I realized that I still hadn't figured out his name. I still couldn't remember which keeper he was supposed to be, but it didn't matter anymore. It didn't matter because I was no longer certain that any of us had individual identities. I was no longer certain that we had ever had individual identities. I was no longer certain of anything except this: the lighthouse will continue its rotation, and the storms will continue to come, and there will always be someone new arriving to take the keeper position, and there will always be old keepers appearing during storms asking about the current keeper, and there will always be the cycle, the pattern, the rotation. There will always be someone new asking for the old keeper. There will always be someone new.